Hi, my name is Jeanie MacFarlane. Welcome to a celebration of No Place for a Woman, the life and Newfoundland stories of Ella Manuel by Antony Berger. I've been thinking about Ella for a long time. My first summer in Newfoundland, a woman in St. John said to me, "If you're headed west, if you're going to Bonne Bay, you'd better find out about Ella Manuel." I found Tony, and I asked him, "Will you tell me about Ella? Tell me about your mother." Ella was a trailblazer. She was widely talented. She had a way of describing vividly and evocatively the particular time and place that were hers. You're in good hands. You're going to enjoy the chat that follows. But first, I'd just like to say, Tony, thank you for telling us about Ella.
When my friend phoned me from Portland Creek and said, "The river's just right, come down for an evening's fishing," I felt as if someone had called me from Mars and invited me to dinner.
Great. Well, welcome, friends. This is a little premiere for the appearance of my new book called No Place for a Woman, The Life and Newfoundland Stories of Ella Manuel. And here we have Renee Finlayson, who lived in Woody Point in the early 1970s and knew Ella very well. John Berger, my brother, who lives in Southern California, and you may see that from the flowers behind him. And my wife, Carol Harris, who is in the basement, and me, Tony or Antony Berger. I'm a long retired geologist, earth scientist, taught universities in various places and been involved in many international projects. Only recently have I started in the non-scientific era, writing, first of all, a history of Bonne Bay, and now this book. My brother John is a geophysicist, retired geophysicist, whose work in seismology was absolutely essential to the development of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty some decades ago. I'm not sure how valid that is today with our friends to the south and their ability to stick to treaties, but his work there and his present work in geophysics has been very important. He still works daily in his office at the Institute for Geophysics and Planetary Physics in La Jolla, Southern California. And Carol Harris, my wife, is a retired education professor who taught school in Newfoundland, music in schools, was a consultant for the province of Newfoundland in music, helped to develop music curriculum in schools across the province, and then taught university in Calgary and Victoria and the departments of education. She was teaching leadership, educational administration, and philosophy, and still works in that area there. So that's the introduction to the four of us. And I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the genesis of this book. And then I'll pass over to John to talk a little bit about Ella's life, to Renee to recall some stories and her memories of Ella and Woody Point. I should add, I think I forgot to add this, that Renee is a master weaver, retired now, but has done very much work in weaving and teaching. And in fact, those of you in Newfoundland who follow the Intangible Cultural Heritage podcast, just today, June the 5th, when we're recording this, her podcast about weaving was placed there. So as a young woman, Ella didn't set out to be a writer. In fact, her studies at Boston University, having finished school in Lewisporte, where she grew up, her degree from Boston University was in chemistry. She was more interested then, I think, in young men, travel, and adventure. In the 1930s, she ended up in England and married my father, Joseph Berger, and through him met many people who were power brokers, politicians, business people, and developed a political sensibility, I think, within her. She had an idea to write a critical book about Newfoundland's colonial past, but that was interrupted by marriage, children, John and I, hated domesticity, and the Second World War, during which we lived in the United States. So she felt rather out of touch with events at home. And so when she got back to Newfoundland, she abandoned that project. She returned to Newfoundland after the war, and she started to read for children on local radio and began to write on local and national affairs for the newspaper, the Western Star. She had her own columns. The Citizen Forum and Think It Over were two titles of her columns. As one example of what she wrote about, she worked with the Scots of Codroy Valley to introduce their music to Corner Brook and Deer Lake, and helped to launch Mary MacIsaac's newspaper column as Mrs. Praty, who wrote letters to the newspaper about the goings-on in the Codroy. During the 1950s, she wrote extensively for newspaper commentaries and published many articles in magazines like the Atlantic Advocate, the Family Herald and Weekly Star, and the Newfoundland Quarterly. And throughout the 60s and 70s, she became quite well known in Newfoundland and across Canada. She wrote a number of conference reports, a biography of music educator Sister Loretta Croak, a short history of Woody Point, and some lovely stories about Newfoundland for Canadian school children. She was always keen to tell young people about our island history and culture. But her great success was a novel for children about a young girl in Notre Dame Bay, Mahala Jacobs, who goes fishing with her grandfather that fine summer. This was first published in 1980 with a second edition 15 years later. It's been used in Ontario schools and is still in print with Breakwater Books. Ella loved to write about the older people and what they recalled about life in the rural areas before and around the turn of the century. That's the 19th century, the 20th century. She also delighted in retelling stories about the sea and seamen, about missionaries, medics, and military men. But try as she might, she couldn't find a way to present her stories for publication in book form. Shortly after she died in 1985, I found among her generally undated letters, journals, and other writings, a number of drafts and completed radio scripts. It seemed to me then that the radio scripts by themselves wouldn't make such interesting reading. But now, 10 years, many years later, her stories have acquired something of the patina of history and may be more interesting today than when she wrote them. There's now, of course, a lot more interest in Newfoundland, in our distinctive cultural history, in writing by local authors, and a busy publishing industry in Newfoundland and in Atlantic Canada. So after reading some of these stories to family and friends and on local community radio on Voice of Bonne Bay, I changed my mind, and this book is the result. Although few people today might remember her, Ella was ahead of her time as a writer, journalist, businesswoman, fly fisherman. She would have, I think, not liked the word fly fisher. She was a political activist and a strong feminist. So I have written something of her life as part of this book. At first, I was reluctant to say much about her two marriages because she herself was a very private person and didn't like to speak, in fact, rarely spoke of her personal life. But after many discussions and debates with Carol, and with advice from well-known novelists Annie Proulx and Elizabeth Hay, and from Breakwater's editor James Langer, I was persuaded to bring these aspects of her life into a short biography, which in this book precedes the stories. I hope this will help readers to understand better her way of speaking and her attitudes to the world around her, and her love, especially for rural Newfoundland. And of course, I hope you will enjoy this book. Before I end, I'd just like to point out a podcast series entitled Down to Sally's Cove. Ella's recordings are so few that a few years ago I decided to read some of her stories to family and friends, and on VOBB, the Voice of Bonne Bay, local community radio. And the reaction to it was so encouraging that I decided to launch a podcast series in which I read one story a week. This has been now available for anybody to listen to. All you have to do is Google Down to Sally's Cove, or check with Spotify or Apple Tunes or Buzzsprout, and you can listen to these stories. I have enough to keep going throughout the summer, one a week, and into the fall. I hope you might enjoy these as well. Thanks for listening.
Dying to hear it.
Yeah.
I'll send you an MP3. Now, I'm going to pass over to my brother, John, to tell you a little bit more about her life. John.
Well, first of all, can you see my screen, which I think I'm sharing with you?
Yep.
Okay. So we have here the, I don't know which view I have of the PowerPoint that I'd like to give you with a little précis of Ella's life. So Ella Manuel had deep roots in Newfoundland. Her grandfather was one of 16 children, descendants of fishing and shipbuilding family originally from Devon in England's southwest. Her father, Robert, the son of George, shown here in this picture, was born in 1873. And as a young man, he fished off the Labrador and later moved to the new town of Lewisporte, which for many years was the commercial and shipping center for northern Newfoundland and Labrador. Taking advantage of its importance, Robert built and operated a general store and a hotel. And this is where Ella and her sister were born. So it was a strange childhood she had there, being raised in such a busy household, centered around the needs of the household guests. Ella would be familiar with the hubbub of the hotel, which helped her develop a sense of the outside world and an ease of meeting strangers. Her parents, being squarely of the merchant class, had more money and influence than most of her generation, and she thought that no children anywhere had as much fun as she did growing up. For years, her parents had been saving for the girls' higher education, though local people thought they were quite mad to educate two young girls. But their parents decided to send her away to college. And because her mother's sister lived in Boston, Ella was sent to live with her, where she gained entrance to Boston University. Here in the big city, she haunted art galleries, libraries, concert halls, and performances of the Boston Symphony, which inspired her to study music. And it was during these years that she learned how to play the piano. In summer, she returned to Lewisporte, where her days were filled with friends, picnics, long walks, boat rides, swimming, and best of all, boys. In 1931, just before graduating from college, Ella wrote to her mother that one of her boyfriends had proposed to her, but that she had no intention of accepting him. To quote from her, "For several years, I have been sending away worthy young men, educated and cultured, who have in their heads the silly idea that it would be very nice for me to get their meals. I don't propose to be a fool and wait for a man who tags along after me, because I have an alert mind inherited from my parents and a good sound background, thanks also to my parents. Do you think that I would throw away all that on a man? Well, hardly." So, well, So Ella had saved up her money during her time back in Lewisporte. As the Depression was deepening and there were no jobs available for her down in the US, she had moved back to Lewisporte and spent a year working for her father, teaching the piano. But she was not yet ready to settle. And by mid-33, she had saved enough to buy a passage, $25 it was, on a ship bound for London. And here she remained for the next 5 years and left a changed woman with her own family and a new outlook on life. She had answered an ad in the London Times for, quote, a young lady, 20 to 25, required to take charge of a boy, age 8, during the daytime for the Christmas holiday month. Must be cultured, intelligent, of good appearance and personality. Joseph Berger, now divorced, was seeking somebody to look after his young son, Peter. Ella was promptly hired. Joe, then in his mid-30s, held a senior executive position with Marks and Spencer, a job with a high salary and lots of prestige. In 1935, Ella and Joe were married, and in 1937, Antony was born. The war was looming and the young family moved to Connecticut, the US, where Jonathan was born in the late 40s. The family soon expanded as Joe's son, by his first marriage, Peter, that Ella had taken care of, now aged 15, and Joe's younger sister, age 14, joined them. In addition, Joe had agreed to look after 2 teenage children from a London friend. So suddenly Ella was responsible for 4 teenagers, Ella as well as her own 2 small children, as her dad, her husband, brother, shuttled between Connecticut and New York City looking for work. One can only imagine. So by the war's end, the marriage had broken up, and Ella had moved back to Newfoundland, where she soon met Lewisporte, a prominent outdoor sportsman who had hired her to work on a film he was making for a Newfoundland tourist board. The friendship blossomed, and in 1946, Lee and Ella were married. They had worked hard to establish a business that catered to US fly fishermen, an idea that Ella got from a chance encounter at a New Brunswick railroad stop. Lee, an accomplished bush pilot, would fly a small Piper Cub up from New York State in the summers to ferry the guests between Ella's Kill Devil Lodge in Lomond in Bonne Bay and Lee's cabins on the northern peninsula at Portland Creek. Let's see, look at it here. But the marriage was not a success. And Ella found herself at the age of 38 back living with her parents, now in Corner Brook, and raising her 2 sons while establishing a reputation as a radio and print commentator. By the end of the decade, she had sold Kill Devil Lodge and longed for a place of her own. And so in early 1960s, she returned to Bonne Bay, this time Woody Point, and built her own house, where she lived for the rest of her life and where most of the stories that are told in this book were written. A few years before she died, Ella wrote of her life, and I quote, "I cannot now join together the parts separated by blanks that I have been able to think about or probe. This is not part of my failure in life or my stupid, ignorant choices and misconceptions. These parts just do not fit. There are too many jagged edges, as if part of a broken pot had crumbled, leaving a nasty and permanent gap. Yet I can turn life around the way I turn the pot, so that I can enjoy its wholeness, knowing full well it is flawed. So thank you for that.
Thank you, John. That's a very detailed, comprehensive look at her life. Thanks so much. I'd like to ask Renee now if she would say something about how she found and how she met Ella in those years in which she and her small family lived in Woody Point.
In 1970, my husband and I spent the summer in Woody Point. We were young, newly married, and on an adventure. We hadn't been in our house a full day before there was a knock at the door. As I approached the storm door, there was a striking, middle-aged woman running her finger down the glass, examining the dust on her fingertip. It was Ella Manuel. Because we were new in town, Ella wanted to know who we were and what we were about. This was the beginning of a friendship I truly valued. We lived near Ella and would visit back and forth frequently, so we got to know each other quite well. Often she invited us up to her house in the evenings, and if we had visitors, they were always welcome too. Her house was like no other home in Bonne Bay. One wall was completely covered in books on politics, on literature, art, history, and an assortment of reference books. It was 1970. Ella knew we were from Quebec, and at the time there were FLQ uprisings. Ella pulled out a book about the former Quebec Premier, Maurice Duplessis, and commented on the many similarities between him and Joey Smallwood. She was remarkably well-informed, politically astute, and opinionated. Sometimes I was intimidated by her knowledge, but I was never made to feel inadequate. On one of these evenings, we met Jonathan. He had just returned from Leningrad. It turns out he and Ella had both stayed in the same Grand Hotel some 40 years apart. They were having a wonderful time comparing the chandeliers in the lobby and the food from the dining room. Ella had been there in the 1930s on a European trip with her sister. I was blown away. I didn't know of anyone who had traveled in Russia on their own at that time. In the summer of 1975, I had just weaned my baby daughter, and Ella and I decided to go on a road trip. It felt quite liberating to be able to leave my husband with the kids and to have a little holiday with Ella. We drove up the Bayvert Peninsula, exploring lots of outport communities in the small coves and bays. We visited a couple of mine sites, had chats with the workers, and Ella always asked about their health. She was curious and concerned about the effects of asbestos on their lungs. On this trip, I discovered that Ella had to have her coffee first thing in the morning. Being in the motel without a stove, she resorted to filling a thermos with hot water from the tap and instant coffee before going to bed, so she could reach for coffee first thing when she woke up. I never knew anyone so addicted. There's another story that I'm a bit embarrassed about and haven't told very many people. About 10 years later, in Halifax, I was on a city bus and I saw Ella standing on the street corner. I was so happy and excited to see her. I jumped off the bus, rushed towards her, and knocked her flat on the ground. Thank God she wasn't hurt and was happy to see me too. We had a good laugh over that. Ella often went away for the winter. One fall, she asked me to look after her only houseplant, a beautiful Hoya that flowered and dripped sweet nectar. Somehow, I never returned that plant. I still have it after all these years and cherish it as I do knowing Ella. an inspiring, formidable woman who didn't need to follow convention. She was a huge influence on me in my formative years. I learned from her example that women can be independent, capable, and have a full and interesting life. Looking back on my first meeting with Ella, she wasn't judging me because of the dirty glass. She was probably just wondering, where did this dust come from?
Renee, thank you so much. That was lovely. I think you keep that plant, and next time I come to visit you, be sure to point it out to me.
I can give you, I have babies. I can give you.
Oh, well, now that's even more interesting.
Even
I think
better,
Carol would probably enjoy that. Thank you so much for those
Oh,
lovely
you're welcome.
I'm going to turn now to Carol and ask you, Carol, to talk a little bit about Ella's political views and her feminism. All yours, Carol, my dear.
And I think we've heard some wonderful stories about it already. In time, I go back 10 years before Renee met Ella. And I first met her 60 years ago when I came to Newfoundland at 18 to teach music in the Corner Brook High School. My experience of rural life up to then had led me to assume that most women toiled in the kitchen and community and took care of husbands and children. How surprised I and another young person on staff was to meet Ella, who had not the slightest interest in any of this. Her interests lay in reading good books, listening to fine music, and hiking the hills round Corner Brook. She became a sort of Pied Piper to us young people, and we followed along where and when we could. For me and so many others, she opened windows of opportunity and demonstrated that the world could be arranged differently. On one exciting adventure, Ella took my young friend, also a newcomer to Newfoundland, and me to Bonne Bay, where she was intent on purchasing land to build her very own house, the one you saw earlier in John's photo. The drive down to Woody Point in 1960 was in itself an adventure. Dirt roads and dust most of the way, and up and down hills higher than I had ever seen before in Nova Scotia. She knew the terrain, of course, and so had packed a lunch that we enjoyed by a beautiful lake, which I now know was Bonne Bay Big Pond. The sights simply multiplied from then on as we tumbled down the struggle into Bonne Bay and had our first glimpse of Gross Mourne and of the tablelands. On that trip, I was able to hold a measuring tape as Ella paced out the dimensions of her planned home. She described to me each window and the opportunity it would afford of the surrounding beauty. Later, she drove my friend and me on the 90-mile dirt track down the peninsula. This was when you'd take the car ferry from Woody Point to Norris Point, then on through the plain, along the plain under the Western Brook Gorge, and the beautiful sandy and rocky beaches, where, because of Ella, we'd have to stop and spend hours collecting stones that were polished by the waves. Finally, we reached the end of the road at Portland Creek. For me, having lived in Nova Scotia, it was simply an amazing experience to reach the end of the road with its bulldozers and toppled trees. So that road was probably a lot rougher than the one that Renee had 10 years later. My thoughts of a traditional existence of marriage, children, preparing meals, and of following the socio-political status quo were not slammed shut, exactly. But from then on, they had to compete with exciting alternatives. Ella introduced me to feminism, although neither of us knew the name of this movement at that time for several more years. At the end of that teaching year, my friend and I went down to the dock at Corner Brook and said goodbye to Ella. who would take the boat to Montreal and then another boat to Australia. We were amazed that anyone would do that. Her son, Tony, was studying in Melbourne, and Ella felt that she had to go down and make a home for the poor fellow. We were amused by the thought of Ella suddenly appearing in Tony's life and stifling some of his youthful fun. We weren't surprised when we heard that she had taken enough time off from homemaking to travel by train right across the continent, from Melbourne to Perth. On that trip, she gathered many notes for her broadcasts back home, not in this book, but in other broadcasts. In any case, the two of them, Ella and Tony, returned the next year to Halifax. Tony and I met, and as they say, the rest is history. For a year later, we married. In the years that followed, Ella visited us as we moved from country to country. In England and later in what was then called Ceylon, she regaled our friends with stories about Newfoundland. She had a great sense of humor. She was a lot of fun. And in every place she traveled, she researched, she talked with the local people and collected stories. There were many lasting effects on my own feminism, but one I prize is that she convinced me of the importance of political involvement. I well recall her walking the floor while listening to CBC radio, drinking yet another cup of coffee and speaking back in quite firm tones to the commentator. Today, I catch myself in these little soliloquies, and like Ella, I know I'm laying plans for action. Thanks a lot.
Thank you so much, Carol, for your comments, and thank you, Renee, for your memories, and John for giving us another view of Ella's life. I want to finish this premiere with a short clip of Ella's voice. Despite the fact that she did many, many recordings, broadcasts for CBC, apparently they only had, 15 years ago, they only had saved one recording. And when I went back a year or so ago to see if they'd found any others, they couldn't even find the one they gave me 15 years ago. Fortunately, I have that. And there's a brief clip to hear her voice as she talks about exploring the new road that was just put in the mid-60s from Rocky Harbor north to St. Anthony. And I think that's a good place to end this. I hope you enjoy this premiere from Breakwater Press, and I hope you enjoy the book. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.
When my friend phoned me from Portland Creek and said, "The river's just right, come down for an evening's fishing," I felt as if someone had called me from Mars and invited me to dinner. You see, a few years ago, to visit Portland Creek would have been a major expedition, fraught with danger of shipwreck, a visit of uncertain duration, since the wrong wind or too much would have marooned me for a week. Now I'm 55 miles from my friend, on a dirt road that meanders along the finger of the northwest coast of Newfoundland, reaches the top, and swings east to St. Anthony, where for the moment it ends. It's known as the Road Down North. Ever since the coast was settled, first by fishermen from Labrador filtering down, and then by Jersey men buying cod, and by Frenchmen who fished for everything that could swim, the people have been isolated. More isolated, indeed, than on other parts of the island, because of the lack of harbors along the coast and the uncertain prevailing weather. Then last year, the ultimate link of road was closed, and 10,000 people suddenly found themselves within reach of the world, a large part of which has been beating a path to their doors ever since. It used to be said that along the northwest coast were only rampikes and poverty. Well, there's plenty of those commodities now, but there's also a landscape that would take your breath away, majestic, empty, haunting. The rhythm of life has indeed changed, particularly in the traditional occupations of fishing and pulpwood cutting. Up in Cook's Harbor, for instance, at the end of the fishing season, when the cod had to be salted and dried, the men carried it on their backs or in hand carts to the barrens to lay it in the sun. And now the trucks whiz along over the rocks, dropping their bundles of wet fish and picking up the dry, and it's easier to cure 1,000 kentals than it used to be to do 100. And for the women, the road means a lifeline to the doctor in the hospital. Mrs. Hopkins reminded me of the last time she saw me down in Norris Point, 60 miles from her home, when she had come 14 hours in a motor dory in the wake of a hurricane with a pregnant woman who had just reached hospital in time to have her life and that of her baby saved. Tears ran down her cheeks when she said, "My dear, you'll never know what that road means to us, down here on this coast with no doctor and no hospital till Norris Point. And for me, that is the one great, shining, hopeful thing that the road down north has brought to my people."